7-year-old Sarah Mitchell clutched Max's collar as they walked through the tree-lined streets of Portland, Oregon, the afternoon sun filtering through the canopy of leaves above them. The golden retriever had been astray when they rescued him from the shelter just 2 years ago, scrawny and scared, his ribs visible through his matted fur. He'd arrived at the animal shelter as a nameless, broken creature, found wandering the industrial streets near the waterfront, and nobody knew his story. But the moment Sarah and her mother saw him through the chain-link fence, something clicked. The dog's eyes held a wisdom that seemed to transcend his suffering, and Sarah had immediately felt a connection, two lost souls recognizing each other across a barrier neither had chosen. They'd named him Max, adopting him on a sunny afternoon that felt like the beginning of better times for their small family of two. For those 2 beautiful years, it had been just Sarah and against the world. They'd built routines together, morning walks before school, afternoon snuggles with Max on the worn living room couch, bedtime stories where Sarah would read aloud to her mother while Max rested his golden head on her lap. Had worked hard as a nurse, picking up extra shifts to provide for her daughter, but the exhaustion never diminished her smile or her dedication. They weren't wealthy, but they were rich in love, rich in laughter, rich in the kind of contentment that money could never buy. Then came Richard. He had appeared in their lives like a plot twist in a story that had been running smoothly. Had met him at the hospital where she worked. He was a pharmaceutical salesman with an impressive suit, an easy charm, and a smile that could light up an entire room. He'd been attentive and thoughtful, bringing flowers to the hospital, asking about Sarah's school, remembering details from conversations and referencing them weeks later. To Sarah, who had grown up without a father figure, Richard seemed like the answer to prayers she hadn't even known she was making. He'd take her to ice cream shops, teach her to play chess, promise her a real family with a father who actually cared. Exhausted from years of being everything to everyone, had been seduced by the promise of partnership, by the idea of finally having someone to share the burden of parenthood. 6 months ago, Richard had moved into their small suburban home, and the fairy tale had begun its transformation into something else entirely. The house itself was modest, a 1970s rambler with a wraparound porch, overgrown bushes that kept promising to trim, and a fenced backyard where Max loved to chase butterflies. It had been their sanctuary, their safe place, their home. But now, the walls seemed to absorb a different energy. At first, the changes were subtle, almost imperceptible. Richard would make comments about how Sarah should behave more like a proper young lady, how her mother's approach to parenting was too lenient and indulgent. He'd suggest that the house needed proper discipline and structure. Eager to make her new marriage work, had nodded along, telling herself that maybe she had been too soft, too permissive. The first time Sarah heard him raise his voice, she'd been startled. It was over something inconsequential. She couldn't even remember what anymore, but the volume and tone had been shocking. Her mother had looked nervous, and Max had moved immediately to Sarah's side, his body suddenly tense. Richard had apologized afterward, blaming stress from work, promising it would never happen again. But it did happen again, and again. His moods became unpredictable, his patience paper-thin, his expectations for Sarah impossibly high. He'd criticize her grades, her posture, her tone of voice, her choice of friends. He'd make her feel small in ways that had nothing to do with her actual size and everything to do with how he wielded his words like weapons. Sarah began walking on eggshells, constantly calculating what might set him off, constantly trying to be different from whoever she was that day. She'd stopped leaving toys on the living room floor. She'd started keeping her bedroom door open exactly 6 inches, not more, not less. She'd learned to eat quickly and quietly, to laugh only when he laughed, to disappear into the background of her own home. Max, however, never left her side. The dog seemed to have developed an almost supernatural awareness of Richard's moods. When Richard was having a good day, Max would relax, but the moment tension began crackling through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm, the dog would position himself protectively. Buried under her own stress and desperate to believe that her marriage could work, seemed oblivious to the changes in her daughter. She worked longer shifts, sometimes double shifts, sometimes overnight shifts at the hospital. Sarah suspected, though she had no words for the thought, that her mother was choosing work specifically to avoid being home, to avoid witnessing something she didn't want to acknowledge. It was easier to stay away. Easier to believe Richard's assurances that everything was fine, easier to pretend that Sarah's withdrawn behavior and anxiety were just normal childhood phases. Sarah's refuge became her room and her dog. She'd spend hours there after school, lying on her bed with Max sprawled across her legs, his warm presence the only thing that made her feel safe. She'd whisper to him about her day, about the kids at school who seemed so confident and untouched by the fear that had become her constant companion. She'd tell him about her dreams of running away, of a life where she could just be a normal 7-year-old without constantly monitoring every word, every gesture, every breath. Max listened. He always listened. His brown eyes would track her face, his ears perked forward, his entire being focused on understanding the weight she carried. It was as if the dog recognized that Sarah was carrying something too heavy for her small shoulders, something that was slowly crushing her beneath its weight. And Max, who had once been a broken stray, seemed determined to help his girl carry that burden. One afternoon, Sarah had looked into Max's eyes and made a startling realization. She wasn't completely alone. She had someone who cared, someone who noticed every shift in her mood, someone who would stand between her and danger without hesitation. Max couldn't fix what was happening, couldn't make Richard disappear, couldn't turn back time to when it was just the two of them with her mother. But he could be present. He could be loyal. He could be the kind of friend that asked nothing, but offered everything. That realization would become crucial in the days ahead, though Sarah didn't know it yet. She couldn't have predicted that Max's love and instincts would become her lifeline, her voice when she had no voice, her salvation when everything seemed lost. For now, she simply held her dog closer and tried to make it through one more evening, one more day, one more breath in the house that had stopped feeling like home. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of Portland weather that seemed to seep into bones and settle there. Mrs. stood at her classroom door, greeting students as they filed in for third period. She'd been teaching at Lincoln Elementary for 15 years, long enough to recognize the subtle shifts in behavior that most people overlooked, long enough to know the difference between a shy child and a frightened one. As Sarah Mitchell walked through the doorway, Mrs. Practiced eye immediately caught something that made her chest tighten with concern. Sarah wore a long-sleeved sweater despite the warm classroom temperature. In itself, this wouldn't have been alarming, but Sarah had been wearing short sleeves just last week during their field trip to the Portland Children's Museum. More concerning than the wardrobe change was Sarah's posture. The girl who had always bounded into class with enthusiasm now moved carefully, as if her body hurt, as if she were navigating an invisible minefield of pain. Her usual greeting of "Hi, Mrs." had been reduced to a quiet nod and a quick glance downward. Mrs. filed this observation away and continued with morning attendance. During the Pledge of Allegiance, Sarah stood with the rest of the class, but she seemed to be favoring her left side, barely moving her right arm. When the students settled into their seats for the math lesson, Mrs. deliberately positioned herself near Sarah's desk, ostensibly to review a worksheet, but actually to observe more closely. As Sarah raised her hand to answer a simple arithmetic question, something she'd normally do with confidence, the sweater sleeve slipped up slightly, and Mrs. saw them. Finger-shaped bruises on Sarah's wrist, dark purple and angry-looking, the kind that only came from being gripped tightly by an adult hand. Mrs. Hart began to race, but she kept her expression neutral. Years of training and experience had taught her to never reveal her alarm directly to a child. She simply smiled warmly at Sarah, praised her correct answer, and moved on. But inside, every alarm bell was ringing. She'd seen these patterns before. A student who'd suddenly withdrawn, who dressed to cover their body, who flinched at unexpected movements, whose grades and participation dropped as if a light switch had been flipped. She'd learned to recognize the silent language of abuse, the unspoken screams that echoed behind closed doors. During art class that afternoon, Mrs. assigned a Draw Your Family project. She watched carefully as Sarah approached the task with a hesitation that broke her heart. The girl selected bright, vibrant colors, reds and yellows and blues for her mother and for Max. She drew her mother holding a stethoscope, depicted herself in careful detail, and rendered Max with an almost reverent attention to every golden curl of his fur. But when it came time to draw Richard, Sarah's hand slowed. She selected a gray crayon and drew a figure without a face, just a blank oval where features should be. The body was angular and threatening, drawn with harsh, aggressive strokes. When Mrs. asked Sarah gently about the incomplete drawing, Sarah simply said, "I don't want to draw his face," and would say nothing more. That evening, Mrs. sat at her small desk in the corner of her classroom after all the students had left and the hallways had emptied. Her first-year teacher's edition was open, but she wasn't reading it. Instead, she was documenting everything she'd observed. The date, the time, the specific details of the bruises, the way Sarah had flinched when another student had accidentally bumped into her during the hallway transition, the withdrawn behavior, the fearful expression in the girl's eyes. She wrote about the artwork, about the faceless figure, about the careful language Sarah used when discussing her home life. She noted how Sarah's academic performance had declined sharply over the past 2 months, and how she'd stopped participating in classroom discussions and group projects. Mrs. knew what she had to do. At 4:47 p.m., she called the County Child Protective Services office. She spoke with a caseworker named David Torres, carefully laying out her observations, speaking in the measured, professional tone she'd cultivated through her mandatory training on recognizing child abuse. She provided Sarah's full name, her address, her parents' information, and the specific details of what she'd observed. Torres listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions, and then explained the process. An investigation would be initiated, but it would take time. The system was overwhelmed with cases, and without immediate danger or explicit admissions from the child, investigations moved slowly through the bureaucratic machinery. "We'll send someone out," Torres had said, "but it might take a few weeks. In the meantime, if you observe anything that suggests immediate danger, you call 911 directly." "Got it." Mrs. had hung up the phone feeling both relieved that she'd done her duty and deeply unsettled that her report would sit in a queue with hundreds of others, waiting for attention that might come too late. She thought about Sarah going home to that house, to whoever had left those bruises on her wrist, and she felt a helplessness that no amount of teacher training could have prepared her for. Over the following weeks, Mrs. continued to observe Sarah carefully, documenting each new detail. The bruises on Sarah's wrist faded, but she noticed marks on the girl's upper arms, finger shapes again, unmistakable and damning. Sarah's anxiety seemed to increase daily. During reading time, she would sit rigidly in her chair, unable to concentrate. During lunch, she barely ate, pushing food around her tray with the plastic fork. She'd developed a nervous habit of pulling at her sleeves, constantly tugging them down, as if afraid her secrets would be exposed. One day, Sarah dropped her pencil and it fell beneath Mrs. desk. When Sarah bent down to retrieve it, Mrs. saw something that made her blood run cold. What appeared to be a thin belt mark across the girl's upper back, visible above the neckline of her shirt. She wanted to scoop Sarah into her arms, wanted to tell her that she knew, that she was safe, that adults were going to help. But she knew that such actions, however well-intentioned, could complicate an investigation if it ever came to that. The waiting was torture. Mrs. called the CPS office twice more, each time providing additional observations, each time being assured that someone would follow up. She knew the system was broken, knew that children sometimes fell through the cracks, knew that her documentation might not be enough. She also knew that she couldn't give up, couldn't stop watching, couldn't stop being the one adult in Sarah's world who was paying attention, who cared, who was building a record that might someday matter. Every afternoon, Mrs. watched Sarah walk to the pickup area, watched the girl's body language shift and contract as she climbed into whatever vehicle awaited her, watched her disappear into an afternoon and evening that Mrs. could only imagine, and didn't want to. She'd made a promise to herself and to Sarah, though Sarah didn't know it. Whatever happened, Mrs. would not stop fighting for this child. She would be the voice that nobody could ignore, the witness that nobody could dismiss, the one person who wouldn't look away. Doctor, the veterinarian at Riverside Animal Clinic, had examined Max twice since Richard moved into the household, and both times she'd noted something peculiar in her clinical notes. Patient displays unusual behavioral anxiety in the presence of certain individuals. Recommend behavioral assessment. The most recent visit, just 3 weeks ago, had been particularly striking. When Richard had accompanied Sarah and to the appointment, Max had exhibited symptoms that resembled those of a severely traumatized animal: trembling, dilated pupils, and a refusal to make eye contact with the man. The dog's blood pressure had been elevated, and his cortisol levels, which had requested be tested due to what she thought was general anxiety, had been through the roof. Doctor had been practicing veterinary medicine for 23 years, and she'd learned that animals possessed an intuitive wisdom that often eluded humans. Dogs, in particular, seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to read human intentions, to sense danger, to recognize threat. She'd seen rescue dogs cower in the presence of abusers, and seen perfectly docile pets become protective when they sensed their family was in danger. Max's behavior was textbook animal recognition of a threat, but Doctor had kept her professional opinion to herself, unsure how to broach such a sensitive topic with clients. What Doctor didn't witness directly, but what was happening in the Mitchell household every single day, was the extraordinary evolution of Max's protective instincts. The dog had always been intuitive. That was part of his nature, part of what had made him such a perfect companion for Sarah. But Richard's arrival had catalyzed something deeper, more primal, more fierce in the golden retriever's psyche. Max had learned to read Richard's patterns like a calendar. He could detect the subtle signs that preceded the man's mood shifts. The particular way Richard clenched his jaw when he was about to lose his temper, the specific angle of his shoulders when frustration was building, the tone of his voice when criticism was imminent. And whenever Max sensed these warning signs, he would immediately position himself between Richard and Sarah, as if creating a physical barrier against the storm he could feel brewing. In the living room, when Richard would settle into his favorite chair with a beer in his hand, Max would lie directly in front of Sarah, his eyes never leaving the man. If Richard stood up suddenly, which he often did when his mood shifted, Max would stand as well, his body tensed and ready. If Richard's voice would rise even slightly, Max's muscles would coil like a spring. The dog had become an early warning system, a canine sentinel standing guard over the girl he loved more than his own comfort or safety. At night, the transformation was most complete. Max had established a routine that was absolutely non-negotiable. He would sleep directly across Sarah's bedroom doorway, his body creating a blockade that no one could cross without stepping over him. Who had become increasingly oblivious to the undercurrents of danger in her own home, had commented once that it was cute how devoted Max was to Sarah. Richard, however, had expressed irritation at the arrangement. He'd tried twice to move the dog, but Max had responded with a growl so low and menacing that it seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. The dog's teeth had been bared, his body language unmistakably aggressive, his message crystal clear: "You do not pass." Sarah had begun to depend on Max's presence in ways that went beyond the comfort of a pet. The dog had become her emotional barometer, her safety gauge, her proof that someone was paying attention to what was happening to her. On the nights when Richard's footsteps would approach her door, when his shadow would appear in the hallway, Max would stand immediately, his protective stance making it impossible for Richard to advance. The man would mutter curse words, would sometimes kick at the dog half-heartedly, would sometimes retreat with angry muttering about "that damn dog." But he never forced the issue. Something about Max's absolute conviction, his unwavering commitment to blocking access, seemed to penetrate even Richard's alcohol-clouded judgment. What Sarah didn't understand, what she was too young and too traumatized to fully comprehend, was that Max's behavior was becoming increasingly unusual, increasingly remarkable. Dogs didn't normally sleep directly across doorways for months on end. Dogs didn't normally maintain such consistent vigilance. Dogs didn't normally refuse food from specific family members or growl at the sound of someone's voice. Max was breaking every rule of normal dog behavior, but he was doing it for a reason that transcended training or breeding or genetics. He was doing it out of pure love and an instinctive need to protect his person from harm. Sarah had begun confiding in Max in whispered conversations during the quiet hours when Richard was passed out on the couch and her mother was at work. She would lie in her bed with her head resting on Max's warm flank, and she would tell him everything. She told him about the day she'd flinched when Richard had raised his voice, about the time he'd grabbed her arm too tightly, about the confusing things he'd said that made her feel wrong and dirty and ashamed. She told Max about her teacher noticing the bruises and asking questions, about the fear that if anyone found out, somehow it would be her fault. She told him about the nightmares that had started, about the way her stomach hurt constantly now, about how she couldn't concentrate at school anymore. Max would listen with an intensity that made Sarah feel less alone. His brown eyes would track her face, following every emotion that crossed her features. His ears would be perked forward, his entire being focused on absorbing every word she spoke. Sometimes he would rest his chin on her chest, his warm breath creating a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with hers, as if they were two heartbeats becoming one. When Sarah would cry, and she cried often these days, usually silently into her pillow, Max would move closer, his body pressing against hers, his presence saying what words could never express. "I'm here. I see you. I won't leave you. You're not alone." There was something almost mystical about their connection. Max seemed to understand not just Sarah's emotions, but also her unspoken needs. When her anxiety would spike, when her breathing would become shallow and panicked, Max would press his body firmly against hers, creating a gentle compression that somehow calmed her nervous system. When the nightmares would jolt her awake in the darkness, Max would be there immediately, his warmth and his steadiness pulling her back from the edges of terror. Other family members, other friends, even Mrs. None of them truly understood the depth of what Max was doing. They didn't realize that this dog had essentially become Sarah's therapist, her protector, her anchor to sanity in a world that had become increasingly chaotic and unsafe. Max was a creature of pure instinct and pure love, and those instincts were telling him that his girl was in danger, that she needed him in ways she couldn't even articulate, that his very presence could be the difference between Sarah's survival and something far worse. The bond between them had transcended the normal human-animal relationship. It had become something sacred, something unbreakable, something that would, in the weeks and months to come, prove to be the most powerful force in either of their lives. Max had found his purpose, not in obedience training or in catching tennis balls or in any of the conventional measures of a dog's usefulness. His purpose was to love Sarah with an absolute, unwavering, protective devotion that would ultimately save her life. Thursday, October 15th began like countless other days. but it would mark the irreversible moment when Sarah's world would shatter into a before and an after, a dividing line between her childhood and something harder, darker, more adult than any 7-year-old should ever have to experience. Had left for her double shift at the hospital at 6:47 a.m., kissing Sarah's forehead while she still slept, leaving a note on the kitchen counter saying she'd be back around midnight. Richard had woken late, shuffling into the kitchen around 10 a.m., with the kind of heaviness that Sarah had learned to recognize. The heaviness of a man nursing a hangover, the irritability that came with morning drinking. Sarah had already eaten breakfast, had already set out her homework materials at the kitchen table in what she thought was a safe, unobtrusive way. She'd learned that the kitchen table was better than her room, that being in Richard's sight line sometimes prevented his anger from escalating. Or at least, she hoped it did. She was working on a math worksheet, fractions that she normally would have found enjoyable, when Richard emerged from his room wearing wrinkled clothes and a darker mood than usual. He'd opened the refrigerator and stood staring into it for a long moment before turning to Sarah with an expression she'd never quite seen before, something twisted and ugly that made her stomach drop. "Why is there only one beer left?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm, the kind of calm that was actually more terrifying than outright yelling. Sarah's throat went dry. She didn't know why there was only one beer. She hadn't touched his beer. But the logic of the situation didn't matter, because Richard had already decided who was responsible for his displeasure. "I didn't," Sarah started, but he'd already stopped listening. "Don't talk back to me," he'd snapped, slamming the refrigerator door so hard that the magnets rattled and a drawing Sarah had made in school fell to the floor. It was a picture of her, her mother and Max, all holding hands or paws, all smiling. Richard had stepped on it deliberately, grinding his heel into the paper as if grinding out the image itself. Sarah's hands had begun to shake. Max, who had been napping in his bed in the corner of the kitchen, immediately stood and moved to Sarah's side, his body tense and alert. The dog's eyes had never left Richard's face, tracking the man's every movement with predatory focus. "And your dog needs to stop staring at me like that," Richard had said, his voice rising now, his hands clenching into fists. "That dog is a problem. That dog's got to go." Sarah had felt something break inside her chest. The thought of losing Max was worse than any physical pain, worse than any emotional torment Richard had inflicted. "No, please," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please don't." But Richard had stopped listening. He'd come around the kitchen table toward her, and Sarah had instinctively pushed her chair back, standing up. She was trying to move away, trying to put distance between herself and the anger radiating off him like heat off summer pavement. Max had positioned himself between them, but Richard had been too fast, too determined, too lost in whatever rage had been building inside him like a pressure cooker about to explode. What happened next occurred in a blur of moments that would be burned into Sarah's memory forever, moments that would replay in her nightmares for years to come. Richard had grabbed Sarah's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh with a pressure that felt like it might break bone. He'd pulled her toward him, and his words had become a harsh, hissing stream of insults and accusations. He'd called her names that no child should ever hear applied to themselves. He'd told her she was worthless, that she was the reason her mother was never happy, that she was a burden, that nobody would ever love her. And then his hands had moved, and his intentions had shifted into something even darker, something that Sarah's young mind could barely process even as it was happening. She'd felt his rough touch in places that made her feel sick and ashamed, felt his breath hot and smelling of beer and cigarettes, felt the absolute violation of boundaries that she was too young to even have proper names for. She'd tried to pull away, had tried to scream, but his hand had covered her mouth, and his voice had become a low, threatening whisper. "If you tell anyone, I'll hurt your dog. I'll hurt Max so badly he'll wish he'd never been born. Do you understand me? Not a word to anyone." Max had been barking, a sound so furious and desperate that it barely sounded like the gentle, loving dog Sarah knew. The dog had been jumping, trying to reach Richard, but the man had pushed him away roughly, and Max had crashed into the wall with a yelp of pain that had shattered Sarah's heart even more than what was happening to her. It had lasted maybe 3 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. Time had become distorted and meaningless. When Richard had finally released her, Sarah had fallen to the floor, gasping, crying, unable to breathe properly. Her body hurt in places she didn't have words for. Her mind felt fractured, as if part of her had detached and was watching this nightmare from somewhere outside her body. Richard had stepped back, and his expression had shifted into something almost remorseful, almost apologetic. "Your mother doesn't need to know about this," he'd said quietly, his voice once again that deceptive calm. "She's already stressed enough at work. You telling her would just upset her, and remember, one word about this and Max disappears. You understand?" Sarah had nodded mutely, unable to speak, unable to do anything but pull herself together piece by fragmented piece. Richard had left the kitchen, heading toward his room, leaving Sarah alone with her pain and her terror and her dog, who immediately abandoned his own hurt to come to her, to press against her, to offer his presence as the only form of comfort available in that moment. Sarah had sat on the kitchen floor for hours, her body curled into a ball, Max's warm weight pressed against her. She'd replayed the events over and over, trying to understand how her world had shifted so completely, how safety had become danger, how the home she lived in had transformed into a trap. She thought about telling her mother, but Richard's threat echoed in her mind. One word and Max disappears. She couldn't lose Max. She couldn't. Max was all she had, the only being who truly loved her, the only one who understood. Around 3 p.m., Sarah had moved to her room, locked the door, and climbed into bed with Max. She'd laid there trembling, feeling dirty and wrong and broken, wondering if what had happened was somehow her fault, wondering if she'd done something to deserve it, wondering how she was supposed to survive another moment, let alone another day, another night, another week in this house with this man. But as Max had rested his head on her chest, his warm breath synchronizing with her ragged breathing, Sarah had made a silent promise to herself. Something had to change. She couldn't live like this. She couldn't survive another day of this nightmare. And more importantly, she wouldn't let anything happen to Max. Somehow, some way, she would find a path out of this darkness. The days following that Thursday blurred together into an endless cycle of survival and despair. Sarah moved through the motions of school like a ghost, present in body but absent in spirit. Mrs. had noticed immediately. The way Sarah's eyes were now vacant, the way she held her left arm protectively against her body, the way she flinched at sudden movements. When Mrs. had gently asked if everything was okay at home, Sarah had simply shaken her head and said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line that said volumes about the fear that had taken root inside her. At home, Richard had reverted to a pattern of faux civility punctuated by threats and intimidation. He would make comments about Max, how the dog was a burden, how accidents happened to animals, how shelters were full of dogs. Each comment was designed to reinforce his power, to maintain Sarah's silence through fear and coercion. She'd become a prisoner in her own home, trapped between the Scylla of telling someone and risking Max's life, and the Charybdis of silence and continued abuse. But Sarah had also begun to pay attention to something she'd learned in a school assembly just 2 weeks before the incident. A police officer had come to speak about personal safety, about recognizing dangerous situations, about asking for help. The officer had emphasized that children were never responsible for what adults did to them, that telling a trusted adult could save their lives, that help was available if they reached out. At the time, it had seemed like standard assembly material that Sarah would forget by lunch. But now, in the darkness of her room with Max pressed against her side, those words echoed with a new urgency. She'd also remembered something from the dog training sessions she'd done with her mother over the summer. They'd learned several commands: sit, stay, come. But there was one command that had always fascinated Sarah: the alert command. Her mother had taught Max to respond to a specific hand gesture combined with a certain word when she wanted him to be on high alert, to pay attention, to be ready for action. Sarah had practiced it dozens of times, and Max had always responded flawlessly, his entire body shifting into a state of heightened awareness. On Wednesday evening, exactly 1 week after the Thursday that had changed everything, Sarah sat on her bed and looked at Max with a desperation that bordered on madness. Richard was in the living room drinking, his voice loud and slurred as he watched television. Her mother wouldn't be home for hours. Sarah knew she couldn't keep living like this. She knew that every day that passed was another day of slow drowning, another day of her spirit fracturing further, another day of paralysis. She thought about the assembly. She thought about the police officer's words about asking for help. She looked at Max and made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. If she ran, if she told someone, if she broke the silence that Richard had forced upon her, what was the worst that could happen? Richard had threatened to hurt Max, but would he really? Was that a real threat or just a weapon he'd wielded to keep her compliant? Sarah realized she didn't know the answer, but she knew with absolute certainty that she couldn't survive another week of this. Her hand trembled as she made the signal, the specific hand gesture her mother had taught Max, the one that meant alert, attention, be ready. But when she made it, her voice cracked with desperation as she whispered, "Max, I need help, please. I need you to help me tell someone." Max's response was instantaneous and extraordinary. The dog stood immediately, his ears perking up with an intensity that Sarah had rarely witnessed. He moved to the bedroom door and began packing, his entire body radiating the heightened awareness that the command was designed to trigger. But then, and this was where Max transcended normal dog behavior, he began barking. Not the gentle, friendly bark he used to greet people, but a sharp, urgent, demanding bark that seemed to echo through the entire house. Richard's voice from the living room was immediate and angry. "Shut that dog up." But Max didn't stop. The barking continued, louder and more insistent, as if the dog was communicating something of vital importance. He ran to Sarah and grabbed her sleeve in his teeth, a gentle but firm grip that was unlike anything he'd done before. Then he pulled, dragging her toward the bedroom door. Sarah understood. Somehow, impossibly, Max understood what she was asking of him. The dog was responding not just to the trained alert command, but to something deeper, some primal recognition that his girl needed help, that action needed to be taken, that the time for silent protection had passed. Richard appeared in the bedroom doorway, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. "What is wrong with this dog?" he demanded, reaching toward Max with clear intention to grab him. That's when Max transformed into something fierce and protective that Sarah had only glimpsed in fragments. The dog's lips curled back, revealing his teeth. A growl emerged from deep in his chest, a sound so primal and menacing that it seemed to freeze Richard in place. The message was unmistakable. "Do not touch this girl." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. This was the moment where everything could change or everything could fall apart. Richard hesitated, and in that split second of hesitation, something crystallized in Sarah's mind. Max believed in her. Max was willing to fight for her. Max was telling her with his entire being that she was worth protecting, that her life mattered, that her voice deserved to be heard. She bolted. She didn't think about the consequences or the threats. She didn't calculate the risks or consider Richard's warnings. She simply ran, her bare feet pounding against the hardwood floor, her breath coming in gasps. Behind her, Max was still barking, still snarling, still creating a barrier between her and Richard with his own body, buying her precious seconds of escape. The front door was unlocked, a small miracle. Sarah yanked it open and ran into the street, the cool evening air hitting her face like a splash of water. Her neighbor's house was just next door, the bright red door that she'd admired 100 times gleaming like a beacon of safety. She ran toward it, her small legs carrying her faster than she'd ever moved before. Behind her, she could still hear Max barking, could still hear Richard cursing, could still feel the weight of her fear and her hope and her desperate need for rescue. She reached the red door and pounded on it with both small fists, her voice coming out in a scream that contained all the terror and desperation of the past week, the past month, the entire duration of Richard's presence in her life. "Help me, please help me, somebody help me." The door opened almost immediately. Mrs., their neighbor, stood in the doorway with confusion on her face that rapidly transformed into alarm as she took in Sarah's appearance. Her tear-streaked face, her disheveled clothing, the absolute terror in her eyes. "Oh my God, sweetheart, what happened? Come inside right now." As Sarah stumbled into the safety of the house, she could still hear Max barking in the distance, still hear him defending her from the only home she'd ever known, still hear him fighting for her with everything he had. And she knew, with a clarity that transcended her 7 years, that Max had just saved her life. Mrs. Maria had lived next door to the Mitchell family for nearly 4 years, long enough to have developed a pleasant but distant relationship with, a polite nod with Richard, and a genuine fondness for Sarah. She'd watched the little girl grow from an energetic 5-year-old to a quieter, more withdrawn 7-year-old, though she hadn't fully processed what that change might mean. Maria was a retired elementary school teacher herself, a widow in her mid-60s who devoted her life to raising 3 children and had spent 32 years shaping young minds before retirement. She possessed the kind of intuitive understanding of children that comes from decades of observation and genuine care. That Wednesday evening, Maria had been watering her garden, a hobby she'd taken up after her husband passed 5 years ago when she heard the barking. It wasn't the normal barking of Max. She'd heard the dog many times before, a gentle creature who occasionally greeted her over the fence. This barking was different. It was urgent, almost desperate, the kind of sound that made the back of her neck prickle with instinctive alarm. She'd straightened up, her hand pausing mid-spray, listening intently. The barking intensified, and then she heard it, a child's scream, raw with terror and anguish. Maria had dropped her watering can immediately. Without consciously deciding to do so, without calculating or hesitating, she'd moved toward the front of her house. She'd been opening her door when she saw Sarah, little Sarah from next door, running down the sidewalk in her bare feet, her clothes disheveled, her face streaked with tears, her entire small body radiating a level of fear that no 7-year-old should ever have to experience. "Help me, please help me, somebody help me." Maria's maternal instincts, honed by decades of working with children and raising her own, had screamed into overdrive. She'd thrown open her red door fully, her arms immediately reaching out. "Oh my God, sweetheart, come inside. Come inside right now." Sarah had stumbled into the house, and Maria had immediately locked the door behind her, her hands shaking as she secured the deadbolt. She'd knelt down to Sarah's level, her experienced teacher's eyes taking in every detail, the terror in the child's eyes, the trembling that seemed to come from deep within her body, the way she was holding her left arm protectively, the physical signs of distress that transcended what any accident or simple childhood injury could produce. "It's okay, you're safe now," Maria had whispered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her own body. She'd pulled Sarah into an embrace, feeling the child's entire frame shake against her chest. Years of experience had taught Maria not to bombard a traumatized child with questions, to simply provide presence and safety first. "You're safe. You're in my house and you're safe." Sarah had clung to her like a drowning person to a life raft, her sobs coming in gasping waves. Maria had guided her to the living room couch, wrapped her in a soft blanket. Something about being covered seemed to help traumatized children feel safer, and simply held her while she cried. She could hear commotion outside, could hear a man's angry voice shouting from the street, could hear Max still barking furiously. She didn't move. She kept her focus entirely on Sarah, on communicating through her steady presence that someone was now in charge, that an adult had taken control, that this child was no longer alone. When Sarah's sobs had reduced to shaking gasps, Maria had finally spoken. "Sweetheart, I need to call for help. I need to call the police. That's okay, right? That's what needs to happen." Sarah had nodded mutely, unable to speak, her eyes still wide with a fear that seemed to come from a place beyond normal childhood anxieties. Maria had picked up her cordless phone with one hand while keeping her other hand on Sarah's shoulder, a physical connection that seemed to anchor the child to reality. 911, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher had answered professionally. "I need to report child abuse," Maria had said, her voice steady and clear despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. "A child has fled her home and come to my house. She's clearly traumatized and in distress. She's 7 years old. Her name is Sarah Mitchell. She lives at 1247 Maple Street, and I'm at 1249 Maple Street. I need police to come immediately." The dispatcher had asked rapid-fire questions, and Maria had answered as best she could while keeping her focus on Sarah. Within minutes, she'd heard sirens in the distance, growing closer. She'd guided Sarah away from the window, not wanting the child to see police lights or experience additional trauma from the official response that was about to unfold. There had been a knock at the door, authoritative but professional. When Maria had opened it, 2 police officers had stood on her porch, their expressions shifting from routine response to deep concern as they took in the situation. Behind them in the street, more officers were approaching the Mitchell house. Maria had invited the officers inside, and they'd immediately begun the professional protocol for situations involving child abuse. "Can we talk to you, Sarah?" One of the officers, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle voice, had asked. Maria had kept her hand on Sarah's back, a steady presence, while the officer had begun the careful process of documenting what had happened. Sarah's responses had been halting and incomplete, trauma making it difficult for her to articulate the details of what had occurred. But her physical condition told its own story. The bruises that were visible, the fear that radiated from her like heat, the way she flinched at sudden movements. The officer had documented everything methodically, her years of experience allowing her to ask questions in a way that was gentle but thorough. Meanwhile, outside, other officers had gone to the Mitchell house. Maria had watched from her window as they detained Richard, handcuffed him, placed him in a police car. The man had shouted protests and denials, but his words had been drowned out by the sound of Max still barking, the dog's protective fury apparently undimmed by hours of intensity. One of the officers had asked about Max, expressing concern for the animal's welfare. Maria had explained that the dog belonged to Sarah and that the child had been clearly bonded to him. The officer had nodded with understanding and had made a note about ensuring the dog's safety. An hour later, Mitchell had arrived home from the hospital, only to be met by police cars lining her street and officers standing on her porch. The devastation that had crossed her face when she'd learned what had happened, what Richard had done, what she'd missed, what her daughter had endured, had been absolute and terrible. She'd collapsed into Maria's arms, sobbing with a grief and guilt that seemed bottomless. "She came to you," had kept repeating. "She came to you. Thank God she came to you." By evening, Sarah had been transported to the hospital for a full examination and documentation of her injuries. She'd been placed in foster care temporarily, pending a full investigation and custody hearing. But before she'd left, she'd asked about Max repeatedly, her fear that Richard might hurt the dog still overriding her own physical and emotional pain. Maria had promised to find out about the dog, had promised to help however she could. She'd given Sarah her phone number, had promised to be there for her, had made a silent vow that this child would not face the legal process alone. As Maria had stood on her porch watching the police cars leave, watching the neighborhood settle back into an uneasy quiet, she'd thought about the extraordinary chain of events that had led Sarah to her door. She'd thought about the courage it had taken for a 7-year-old to run, to ask for help, to break the silence that her abuser had enforced. And she'd thought about Max, still somewhere in that house, still loyal, still loving, still waiting for his girl to come home. She made a mental note to call the animal control officer first thing in the morning to ensure that Max was being properly cared for, and that he could be reunited with Sarah as soon as possible. A child like Sarah, who had just survived what she'd survived, would need that dog more than ever. The months that followed Sarah's escape were a blur of legal proceedings, therapeutic sessions, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding a life that had been shattered. The case had been assigned to Judge, a 61-year-old jurist with 28 years of experience on the bench, and a reputation for being tough but fair, particularly when it came to cases involving child welfare. Judge had overseen hundreds of family court cases, but there was something about Sarah's situation that had struck her deeply, perhaps because the evidence was damning, but the case presented a unique challenge in terms of conviction and sentencing. Richard had been arrested and charged with multiple counts of child abuse, including physical assault, endangerment, and a more serious charge related to the specific incident that had prompted Sarah's escape. His defense attorney, a high-priced lawyer named who specialized in defending men in abuse cases, had immediately begun crafting a narrative designed to create reasonable doubt. The strategy was twofold. First, to suggest that Sarah's allegations were the traumatized fantasies of a confused child, and second, to imply that Sarah's mother had coached the girl to make false accusations as part of a custody dispute or revenge plot. The prosecution's case, led by Assistant District Attorney Jennifer, was solid but faced a fundamental challenge. A traumatized 7-year-old's testimony against an adult defendant's denials rarely resulted in conviction unless there was substantial corroborating evidence. Yes, there were bruises that matched Richard's hand size. Yes, there were hospital reports documenting signs of abuse. Yes, there was the testimony of teachers, neighbors, and mental health professionals about Sarah's behavioral changes and trauma symptoms. But defense attorneys specialized in casting doubt on all of it, in suggesting alternative explanations, in exploiting the ambiguities that always existed in cases of child abuse. Ada had been wrestling with the problem for weeks. She knew Sarah would have to testify, and she knew that Richard's defense would be brutal. The girl would be forced to relive her trauma in front of her abuser, to answer leading questions designed to undermine her credibility, to endure the psychological torture of cross-examination by a skilled attorney. The thought of putting a 7-year-old through that ordeal broke her heart, but she also knew it might be necessary. However, she'd been brainstorming with Dr., a child psychologist who specialized in trauma, and had been working with Sarah throughout her recovery. And Doctor had suggested something unprecedented. What if the child's testimony could be corroborated by a non-human witness? "You mean an animal behaviorist?" had asked, confused. "Not exactly," Doctor had explained. "I mean the dog itself. The animal's behavior in the courtroom could serve as independent corroboration of Sarah's emotional state during the incident and her current trauma response. Dogs don't lie. They can't be coached. Their behavioral responses are instinctive and genuine." The idea was bold, unusual, perhaps even unprecedented in their jurisdiction. But Judge, after hearing the proposal in chambers, had agreed to allow it as an experimental approach. She'd ordered that expert testimony be provided by Dr. Helen, one of the country's leading experts in canine behavior and trauma response in animals. Doctor had examined Max thoroughly and had reviewed the detailed behavioral documentation that Maria had kept since Sarah's escape. She'd interviewed everyone who knew Max, Sarah, Maria, even the veterinarian. Her conclusion was striking. Max's protective behaviors, his refusal to accept food from Richard, his aggressive responses to the man's presence and voice, and his unwillingness to leave Sarah's side, all aligned with patterns of animals responding to genuine threat and trauma in their human family members. More significantly, Max's bond with Sarah appeared to be the kind of rare, extraordinary connection that transcended normal dog-owner relationships. It was almost symbiotic, as if the two creatures had become spiritually intertwined through shared suffering and mutual protection. The trial date arrived on a cold morning in February, 3 months after Sarah had run to Mrs. House. The courthouse was an imposing building with marble columns and an atmosphere of serious institutional weight. Sarah was terrified. She'd been prepared by victim advocates and therapists, had been walked through the process repeatedly, had been assured that she would be safe. But nothing could fully prepare a 7-year-old for the experience of facing her abuser in a courtroom full of strangers. Sat behind her daughter, her hand resting on Sarah's shoulder as they waited for the proceedings to begin. Maria was there as well, along with Mrs. from school. The courtroom gallery gradually filled with lawyers, court officials, and a handful of journalists who'd caught wind of the unusual case. Judge entered, her black robe seeming to command the room into silence. Richard sat at the defense table, his expression alternating between contrition and confidence. His attorney had coached him on the importance of appearing sympathetic while maintaining his innocence. The prosecution presented its case methodically. Testimony from the hospital about Sarah's injuries. Testimony from Mrs. about Sarah's behavioral changes and the bruises she'd observed. Testimony from Maria about finding Sarah on her doorstep in a state of terror. Then came the cross-examination, and strategy became clear. He attacked Sarah's credibility gently but persistently, suggesting that her trauma had confused her memory, that she might have confused what Richard had said with what he'd done, that young children were particularly susceptible to suggestion and false memory. It was psychological warfare, and Sarah's small frame seemed to shrink under the weight of it. But then came the unprecedented moment. The prosecution called Sarah to testify, and as she was being sworn in, Ada made her motion. "Your Honor, we would like to introduce behavioral testimony from the defendant's household dog as corroborating evidence of the child's testimony." Objected strenuously, but judge overruled him. "This court has already approved this approach in chambers. Proceed." Doctor about canine behavior, about trauma responses in animals, about the extraordinary bond between Sarah and Max. She explained how dogs don't form protective behaviors based on false accusations. They respond to genuine threat and genuine trauma. She described Max's behavioral patterns in detail, explaining what each response meant in terms of what the animal had witnessed and understood. Then came the climactic moment. Sarah took the stand, looking impossibly small in the witness chair. Her voice was barely audible as she began describing what had happened, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the table. The courtroom was deathly silent, hanging on every word. And then, the prosecution played a video that had been recorded the previous week. A video of Sarah making the specific hand signal she'd used on that terrible day, combined with audio of her voice making the command she'd given to Max. Max was brought into the courtroom on a leash, held by a court-approved handler. The moment the dog saw Sarah, he strained forward, whimpering softly. Then Sarah made the hand signal, the exact same gesture that had started the chain of events leading to her escape. Max's response was instantaneous and unmistakable. His body language shifted into a state of heightened alert and protection. He stood rigidly, his focus entirely on Sarah, his protective stance screaming loyalty and awareness. His ears perked forward, his muscles tensed, his entire being communicating the gravity of the moment. The judge watched intently, her expression unreadable, but something in her eyes shifted as she witnessed this silent communication between girl and dog. In that moment, without words, without testimony, without anything that could be cross-examined or disputed, Max was telling the truth. The dog's behavior perfectly corroborated Sarah's account of what had happened, of the fear she'd felt, of the danger she'd perceived, of her desperate need for help. Stood to object, but his voice lacked conviction. Everyone in the courtroom had just witnessed something extraordinary, a non-human truth-teller testifying through pure instinct and pure love. The dog couldn't be coached. The dog couldn't be confused. The dog couldn't be impeached on cross-examination. The dog simply was, communicating through behavioral language what humans struggled to articulate with words. Judge's gavel would fall later, but in that moment, with Max standing protectively beside the small girl who had saved her own life through courage, and the extraordinary bond with a loyal dog, the outcome seemed inevitable. Judge's chambers were quiet except for the sound of her pen moving across paper as she crafted what would become one of the most significant rulings of her judicial career. The trial had ended 4 days earlier, and the jury had deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Richard had been convicted of aggravated child abuse, endangerment, and assault. Now, on this Thursday afternoon in late February, Judge was preparing her sentencing statement, a document that would become part of legal precedent, quoted in law journals and cited in future cases involving child protection and innovative evidence presentation. The courtroom was packed on sentencing day. News of the case had spread beyond Portland, beyond Oregon, reaching legal circles and child advocacy organizations across the country. The story of the little girl and her protective dog, of how an animal's instinct had served as irrefutable testimony, had captured the public imagination. Judge looked out at the gallery. Sarah sat in the front row with her mother on one side and Maria on the other, her small frame still looking fragile but somehow also stronger than it had during the trial. Mrs. was there, as was Dr. Helen. Even Dr. Sarah's therapist had come to witness the conclusion of this remarkable case. Richard sat at the defense table in an orange prison jumpsuit, having been held in custody since the verdict. His expensive attorney looked defeated, all of courtroom strategies having ultimately failed against the undeniable truth that had been communicated through Max's behavior. The judge looked directly at Richard, and her expression was grave. "Mr. Richard Harrison," Judge began, her voice filling the courtroom with quiet authority. "You have been found guilty of aggravated child abuse, endangerment, and assault against a 7-year-old child in your care. Before I pronounce sentence, I want to make a statement for the record that I believe will be important not only for this case, but for future cases involving child protection and innovative evidence presentation." The courtroom was utterly silent. Reporters leaned forward, scribbling furiously in their notebooks. "In my 28 years on the bench," Judge continued, "I have presided over hundreds of cases involving child welfare and abuse. I have seen the perpetrators of abuse employ sophisticated strategies to evade accountability, to create reasonable doubt, to exploit the inherent challenges in prosecuting cases where the victim is a young child. This case presented all of those difficulties. The victim was 7 years old. The defendant was an adult who had authority in the child's home. The alleged abuse occurred in private, with no adult witnesses. She paused, her gaze moving across the courtroom as if she wanted everyone to fully understand the significance of what she was about to say. "However," Judge said, her voice gaining strength, "what made this case extraordinary was not the crime itself, but rather the truth-telling that occurred through an unconventional but undeniable source. I am speaking, of course, about the behavioral testimony provided by the child's dog, a golden retriever named Max." Sarah's hand moved to her mother's hand, gripping it tightly. Somewhere in a secure facility in the courthouse, Max was waiting, having spent the day there as part of the judicial process. The dog would be returned to Sarah's custody today, as the judge had ruled in a separate decision. The defense argued that this animal testimony was improper, irrelevant, and inadmissible, Judge continued. But I believe that what we witnessed was truth in its form. A dog cannot be coached to lie. A dog cannot rehearse false memories. A dog cannot be confused by clever cross-examination. What a dog can do is respond authentically to genuine threat, genuine trauma, and genuine emotional distress. And Max responded authentically on that day in this courtroom. Judge leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the bench before her. The defendant will serve a sentence of 15 years in the Oregon Department of Corrections. He will be eligible for parole after serving a minimum of 10 years. But I want to be clear on the record. This child did not deserve what was done to her. This child showed extraordinary courage in breaking her silence and reaching out for help. And this child was saved, in no small measure, by the unwavering loyalty and protective instinct of an animal who loved her more than his own safety or comfort. Judge's eyes were glistening with tears, something that shocked the courtroom, as judges were trained to maintain emotional neutrality. But Judge was not the kind of jurist who hid her humanity when justice demanded its expression. "I am also establishing a legal precedent," Judge announced. "In future cases involving child testimony, particularly in cases where the child is very young, courts in this jurisdiction are now authorized to consider behavioral evidence from household animals as corroborating testimony. This is not a replacement for traditional evidence or witness testimony, but rather a supplementary tool that recognizes the extraordinary capacity of animals to sense and respond to genuine threat and trauma." The courtroom erupted in a murmur of conversation. Judge banged her gavel once, and silence returned. "Furthermore," she continued, "I am recommending that the state legislature consider incorporating this precedent into formal statute. Child protection is paramount in our legal system, and if animals can assist in that protection through their authentic responses, then we should embrace that assistance." This case has taught us that justice sometimes comes from unexpected sources. As Richard was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at Sarah, but she was no longer watching him. Her entire being was focused on the door at the side of the courtroom through which a handler was now entering with Max on a leash. The moment the dog saw Sarah, he began straining forward, his entire body trembling with the effort to reach her. Sarah jumped to her feet and ran toward the dog, and Max met her halfway, their bodies colliding in an embrace that was pure love and pure recognition. Sarah buried her face in Max's fur, her shoulders shaking with sobs that were finally sobs of relief rather than terror. Max licked her face repeatedly, his tail wagging so hard it seemed his entire back end was involved in the celebration. Wrapped her arms around both her daughter and the dog, and Maria stood nearby with tears streaming down her face. Mrs. had to excuse herself from the courtroom, overcome by emotion. In the days and weeks that followed, Sarah's story became national news. Legal experts debated Judge's precedent-setting decision. Animal behaviorists spoke about Max's extraordinary response on television programs and podcasts. Child advocacy organizations cited the case in their educational materials. But for Sarah, the legal significance of the verdict paled in comparison to the simple, profound reality. She was safe. She was free. She had her mother back, fully present and no longer living in denial. And she had Max, the faithful, protective, love-filled dog who had saved her life through nothing more and nothing less than the absolute purity of his devotion. 3 months after the sentencing, Sarah was back at Lincoln Elementary. Mrs. had kept her seat empty, waiting for the day the girl would return. The classroom erupted in quiet cheers when Sarah walked through the door. Her classmates had been told nothing specific, only that Sarah had been away and was now back. But children instinctively understood that something significant had happened, that this small girl had gone through something that required extraordinary courage. That evening, Sarah and Max sat together in their favorite spot in the backyard, a corner where the fence provided shade and shelter. The house had been thoroughly renovated. Richard's belongings had been removed as if he'd never existed, had taken a job at a different hospital to create distance from the place where she'd met him. The family was rebuilding, slowly and carefully, one day at a time. Sarah wrapped her arms around Max's neck and whispered words that only the dog could hear. Words of gratitude, words of love, words of the deep spiritual connection that had been forged through fire and suffering and ultimate salvation. Max rested his head against her chest, his heartbeat synchronizing with hers, and in that moment, in that quiet corner of a backyard in Portland, Oregon, 2 survivors held each other and simply breathed in the reality of their freedom, their safety, and their unbreakable bond. The case would become known throughout the legal world as Mitchell v. State, but for Sarah and Max, it was simply the story of how love had saved them both. It was the story of a girl who had found her voice through the loyalty of a dog. It was the story of how justice could sometimes come through the most unexpected sources. And it was a story that would live on in the hearts of everyone who heard it, a testament to the extraordinary power of protection, devotion, and the fierce love that exists between a child and the animal who chooses to stand beside her, no matter what.